we're talking about the idea of ministry within ministry. And we'll get to these illustrations a little bit later, but the idea being that when we do ministry, and we're talking tonight specifically, I'll throw this out there. We're talking tonight because one could leave and say, well, you know, my ministry is this over here. And I get that. We're talking about ministries under the umbrella of the church, of the local church. In my opinion, you know, when I look at the book of Acts, I see no Bible colleges, I see no missions agencies, I see no Christian schools, I see none of those things, and that's because I believe when the church is doing what the church ought to be, there's no need for those things. When the church is really making disciples, there's no need to go to Bible college. You know, if the church is really teaching the Bible, I remember years ago when I went to my pastor and said, hey, I'm thinking about going to Bible college. He said, that's good, and he didn't talk me out of it. I'll throw this out there. He did not talk me out of it. But what he did was he said, you know, you could go to Bible college or you could get involved here, and because we teach the Bible, you could just learn the Bible here, and you could learn about practical ministry. And I thought, wow. You know what? He's right. And I started going down to our resource room and just checking out Bible study resources, and I basically put myself through Bible college. And what's so exciting to me about that is ministry no longer has to be this thing like when I go there, I'll start doing this. It can be, I'm right here. I can bloom where I'm planted. I can be discipled. I can put my hand to the plow, and we together can start doing ministry right now. And that's super exciting to me. Ephesians chapter 4, let's just remind ourselves that one of the main purposes of the church is for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. It's not the only purpose of the church. You know, the purpose of the church is to worship Jesus. The purpose of the church is to make disciples. The purpose of the church is to evangelize the lost. But here's the thing. When we talk about those things, especially the third one, evangelizing the lost, and we talk about the church, I believe the church is you and me. That you and I are the church. The church isn't this building. This just happens to be where the church meets. But it's you and me that is the church. But why I think it's so important that we grab a hold of the idea that it's you and me as the church, that we're tasked with going and evangelizing the lost, that prevents us then from developing the mindset that it's somehow the responsibility of an organization to head up evangelistic outreaches, and when they do that, I'll be a part of it. Jesus spoke to you and me as individuals and said, you go and preach the gospel, not wait for the church to organize a crusade, and then when they do that, you be a part of that. Other than that, you have no responsibility to tell people about Jesus. Right? It's you and me. We go tell people about Jesus. And honestly, if you and me are going and telling people about Jesus, there's no longer any reason for the church as an organization to schedule anything that's evangelistic, because you and me are now out there doing it. We're bringing people in, and we get to do what we're really called to do, which is teach the Bible and make disciples. And so one of the things that the church primarily is called to do is what we see here in Ephesians chapter 4. We've looked at this in weeks gone by. Again, let's remind ourselves of it tonight. It says in verse 11, and he himself, that's Jesus, gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, verse 12, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. That really is the mission of the church. The equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. And then as you move your way down to verse 16, there Paul talks about how the whole body is joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share. That, he says, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. But the idea of the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Church is not meant to be this place where we come in and it's kind of a free-for-all. Church is not really meant to be this place where it's an anything goes type of atmosphere. Church is meant to be this place, because remember, God's not the author of confusion. And here's the thing, and I said this in a previous study, and I don't want to repeat everything I've said, but I kind of got to connect these two, because last week we took a break and talked about prayer and spiritual warfare. But God always has a plan. You know, I mean, we live in a day and age where things like organization, planning, structure, they don't have a lot of regard. You know, a lot of times we can kind of want to take a very loosey-goosey type, oh, you know, if the Lord's in control, he'll bring it all together type thing. And that's just not like the God that I see when I look in the Bible. You know, like when we fell in the garden, it wasn't like at that point God started scrambling going, I got to figure this out, you know? Jesus was the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. I mean, he knew it was going to happen, and he planned for that contingency. In fact, what's really mind-blowing, when you start talking about things like Paul talks about in Ephesians, the eternal purpose of God, God let it happen because glorified man is more magnificent than perfect man. That if God had made perfect man, that wouldn't have shown off his grace. The only thing that would have shown off his grace, which according to Ephesians chapter 2 is the thing we will be celebrating throughout all of eternity, there had to be an offense so that God could forgive it and show his grace and take our place and demonstrate his great love for us. And redeemed man now reveals the glory of God in a way that perfect man never would have. The plan of God. Now, remember, the wisdom of man, right? It's foolishness with God. I mean, the things that we would come up with, right? God choosing to be born as an infant in a manger in the middle of nowhere. That's just not the plan I would have come up with. You know, you and me sinning and falling in the garden to show off God's wisdom, that's not how I would have planned it. But that's because our planning, our purposes hardly ever align with God's. So it's so important that we seek him out for what's his plan, what's his purpose. But he's so structured. Creation has an order. Spiritual stuff has an order. I mean, when you start talking about things where the angels are offended at the fact that when we, violate the order that he created things. Angels, of course, coming very, very close to the idea of someone rebelling and leaving their order. Satan, of course, leaving and taking a third of the angels with him because of no regard for God's established structure. Those things become important so that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that things like planning, structure, organization, that they're somehow carnal. They're not. Planning, organization, structure, those are things that all reflect the character and nature of God. And in church, we have to be careful that we don't take the approach that church is one of those things where we just kind of come and kind of figure out what we're doing. You know, I got to be honest with you. And somebody's going to make the connection here and go, he wants church to be like that. No, not necessarily. But I will say this. There are places that I go. There are places that I take my family. And I'll just throw it out here and, you can judge me as you will. Okay? But Disney is amazing. It really is. When you look at the underbelly of how they do things, the fact that they have a secret code that they all speak in, the fact that their cast members are not to break character when they're interacting with you, the fact that they aren't allowed to point with one finger, they have to point with two. The fact that when somebody throws up and they announce it through the park, they don't say, "Oh, we got throw up over here at the Astro Orbiter." They say, "We have a protein spill." You know why? Because they don't want to break you out of the fantasy that you're enjoying. The fact that they have all these tunnels underground for the purpose of when there's trash, they grab it before you see it. They pipe in the smell of popcorn. All these things. I'm not saying I want church to be, I was tempted though when I saw the popcorn machine when I came in. I thought we should just start piping that in, But I think there's a lesson to be learned about doing things with excellence. About creating, look, if we have respect for establishments in the world, and look, Disney's one of them. But if we drive by places or we see establishments or businesses or corporations and we respect the fact that, wow, they really do it well, why wouldn't we have the approach to church that we should make this the most excellent place we can for the worship of Jesus? That's what I want. You know what I mean? I mean, I really want a place where when people come in, they're not blown away with our professionalism. But I can remember one time when we were living in Ireland, we went to this Indian restaurant that was right up the street. So we went there after church one day, and I asked the guy, we made friends with the guys that were working there, and I said to the guy, I said, hey, do you have any decaf coffee? And he said, no. He said, but I'll get you some. And I was like, no, don't worry about it. He was like, no, it's okay. I said, no, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Sure enough, I looked up about 5 minutes later, and this guy went out the front door and walked down the street. And I was like, what's he doing? Came back. He had just gone down the street, bought decaf coffee, came back and made me a cup of coffee. And I was like, what are you doing? I thought, what a servant. You know what I mean? And it's like, wow, there's a lesson to be learned there about how we serve each other. I've never forgotten it. The fact that that guy went out of his way to do that for me. God desires that all things be done decently and in order. And of course, that requires planning. It requires structure. It requires order. It kind of drives me nuts. And again, bear in mind, we're talking a little bit about a concept, and we're going to leave from here in just a moment and go to another passage. But there's a lot of circles, a lot of Christian circles nowadays where Jesus is almost painted out to be this revolutionary who had no real regard for authority. And what that does is it fuels kind of the rebel without a cause type mentality of, oh, I'm just gonna, I don't have to listen to anybody. I mean, we talked about it again in weeks gone by. One of the things that's plaguing the church today is this mentality that, hey, I'm a believer, you're a believer, I don't have to listen to anybody, I'm just here to follow the Lord. I understand that on one regard, but at the same time, I also see that when I look into the scriptures, in almost every arena of life, God has built the idea of authority and submission into our lives. As kids, we're called to submit to our parents. Wives, I know this is your popular passage, you're called to submit to your husband. We are all called to submit to the government. We're called to submit to church leadership. Look, none of us like those things, and that's because we're made in the image of Adam. We inherited his fallen nature, and we're all rebellious by nature. I would love a version of Christianity that taught me I don't have to listen to anybody. The problem is, it's just not true. It just doesn't exist. And Jesus himself flat out said, I don't do anything except what my Father tells me to do. And here's how we know that submission does not imply inferiority, because Jesus was fully God, but he willingly submitted to God the Father. No less God, totally equal with God, but arranged under the authority of God the Father. So if someone ever tries to sell you this trip that submission somehow implies you're less than or inferior, that is so not true. That is a lie that Satan would love to have our rebellious nature grab a hold of and fight against. Right? What am I getting from the back over there? Okay, let's do this. Springboard from here over to Matthew chapter 8. We're going to look at this real quickly in a passage that we see, and then we're going to go from here to another passage in the Old Testament. This is when Jesus encounters the Roman centurion. Matthew chapter 8, it says in verse 5, Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, it says a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will